Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to join us for the first in our webinar series for the 2025 Young People's Continental Congress. This is a really exciting partnership between Carpenters Hall, National History Day, and a whole collaboration of organizations and funders who've reached out to really step forward and help educate both teachers and students about the importance of the First Continental Congress specifically, but also the much larger picture of the founding era and the founding ideals and how they apply to everything we do when we look at in United States history, but also in modern civics and debates and discussions that we have every day. My name is Lynn O'Hara. I'm the Deputy Director for Educational Programs here at National History Day, and very, very excited to be joining you. Let's go ahead and start with just a couple little bits of housekeeping. First thing to know, you have a Q&A box and you are welcome to use it at any time. If there's a question that's been sticking in your head about the readings, about what we're talking about tonight, we're going to take a whole bunch of questions at the end. So if something pops in your head, please jot it down so you don't forget. We do have chat disabled on this account. That's intentional. We use this account with students and yeah, sorry, we disable it. The way we take attendance is by the survey that you take at the end. So make sure at the end when we give you the QR code or the link that you complete that. Now, one thing to know about Google Classroom, it is not, it's a computer, it's not a person. So Google Classroom is emailing you right now and telling you that webinar 1 is late. I promise you're not late, it's totally okay. We'll get in tomorrow and give credit to everybody who did this. And if you need it on video, we'll send it to you afterwards. So don't stress about that at all. The next thing to know is that we do have live captioning enabled. So it will caption our speakers throughout the night. It is AI generated. It's not perfect. It's pretty good. If it helps you hear or understand us, great. If you think that it's annoying or bothers you or gets in the way, then just go ahead and hit that live CC button. It'll turn it off, and if you change your mind, you can turn it back on again the same way. Teachers, if you're looking at something and like, wow, I really want to have that slide or that quote or that source tomorrow in the classroom, don't stress about it. I promise we're going to post the slides and the video to tonight so that you can use it in your classroom tomorrow morning. Now, some reminders as to where we're at. Teams. Discussion board is wrapping. Last discussion replies are due tonight. Now, if you forgot, please wait till afterwards. Please don't try to post and listen at the same time. That never goes well. Your delegate social media profiles are due this Thursday by midnight Eastern time. Now, we've already seen some of the teams turn them in. Keep in mind that either the student or the teacher can post it. Who just need one person to submit, we'll go ahead and take a look at it and make sure that that feedback goes to both the student and the teacher so that they can both see it. It's a duplicate grade. Module 2, where we're going next, will launch this Friday. And we're going to follow that cycle. Every time we wrap a module, you turn in your assignment, and then we launch the next day to go into the next 4 weeks. The other fun thing that we launched for you today are your travel forms. It's about time to figure out how we're going to get you all to Philadelphia. And, unlike in 1774, you don't have to ride the horse and the wagon across the bumpy roads. We've got some much better transportation options. What we have here is what we think makes the most sense for the teams in terms of which teams will be flying, which will be taking Amtrak, and which will be driving. Now, what we need you to do is take a look at this. If you're one of those train or drive where you're like, hey, it actually would be easier for us to hop on the train, let us know. But for the most part, this is how we figure out you're going to come and visit Philadelphia. Now, what we need you to do is to go into Google Classroom and download the correct travel form. You only have to fill out one. If you're a flying team, fill out the one marked flights, and don't worry about the other two. We're going to ask you to complete the form, which includes getting a student, teacher, and parent or guardian signatures on it. And we're going to ask those to get hand signed. So print out a copy and work it out that you can share and review the information. We are going to ask you to scan and upload it to Google Classroom. By Monday, February 3rd, that allows our team to start making those very important reservations. Couple of key ideas to make sure you know. The number one thing people forget to do on this form, I know teachers, you're not going to be surprised at this, is to put their name on the form. Please put your name on the form. We can't book a ticket without a name. Now, for your name, please use your legal name as it appears on the ID with which you will travel. So for most of you, that will be a driver's license, a non-driver state ID, or a passport. Please double check that it knows if you have, if you have your middle name on there, don't have a middle name, have an initial, just make sure it matches exactly to your travel document. The second reminder, when you put your date of birth, please put the year. We promise we're not going to share anybody's age with anyone else, but we need that key birth date in order to book the reservations. Finally, if you are flying or taking the train, we'll ask you for your first choice, airport or station, and the second choice, if there is a feasible alternative. That's really important. Please look at the options. If there is a second option, great. Some of you live where, it's an hour to this airport or an hour to that airport, great. If the second option is not feasible, if that second option is 8 or 9 hours away, please don't give it to us. It's important that we book something that is going to work for all of the teams on the first try. All right, what we'll do is if you have specific questions about your situation, please reach out to us. Reach out to Ms. Hollyfield. She'll help you. I'll help you. We'll make it work. Our goal is to expand this. The one thing I will mention, if there is an interest in extending someone's trip, so either coming early or leaving later, that can be done if and only if the student's parent or guardian or designated family member will be meeting them and either bringing them to YPCC or taking them from YPCC. For our intents and purposes, we cannot book travel and have students traveling alone for safety and liability reasons. Now, if parent or guardian wants to come in and meet the student and then they want to stay or they want to go to New York or Washington, that's fine, because then that parent or guardian would accompany that student home. If you do have a situation like this, let us know and we'll coordinate with you to make it as smooth as possible. All right, that's all that I have from our end in terms of logistics. So what I'm going to do at this point is turn things over to Mr. Morris, the Executive Director over at Carpenters Hall, to give a little welcome and set us in the place of Carpenters Hall, and then he'll turn things over to Dr. Gillis. So, Mr. Norris, you're on.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. As Ms. O'Hara said, my name is Mr. Norris. I am the Executive Director of the Carpenters Company of the City and County of Philadelphia. The Carpenters Company is the nonprofit organization that owns and operates Carpenters Hall, which you can see behind me, and where the First Continental Congress took place in the fall of 1774. The company was founded in 1724 as a trade guild for Philadelphia's master builders and was modeled after the Worshipful Company of Carpenters in London, which dates back to the Middle Ages. The original purpose of the company was to set standards for quality building design and construction, to train apprentices, and to provide mutual aid to members and their families. In the early 1770s, the company built Carpenters Hall as its meeting place. It was finished just in time to host the First Continental Congress. And as you learned from the readings for today, there was some drama among the delegates on the selection of the hall as the permanent meeting place for the Congress. I won't go into that here, but I will tell you that the choosing of Carpenters Hall for the Congress ultimately led to a significant shift in the mission of the Carpenters Company. By the middle of the 19th century, we were primarily focused on preserving the hall as a historic site and museum. Carpenters Hall has been open to the public since 1857, and we are very proud of our centuries of commitment to preserving this historic space and engaging our visitors in understanding how the First Continental Congress laid the foundation for American independence. Over 100,000 people visit us each year, and our 200+ members today are among Philadelphia's leading architects, engineers, and contractors. the professional descendants of the master builders who founded the company and built Carpenters Hall. The Young People's Continental Congress was conceived as the primary way for the Carpenters Company to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Continental Congress as part of the America 250 semi-quincentennial that will take place in Philadelphia and around the country in 2026. Next year will be all about the Declaration of Independence, but we felt it was important to acknowledge that the events of 1776 did not happen in a vacuum and that the path to the Declaration was fascinating and noteworthy in its own right. Since so many of the issues of governance and representation that engage the delegates to the Continental Congress continue to affect our civic discourse today, we knew the best way to commemorate the Congress was not to stage some stuffy reenactments with men in wigs, but rather to convene students from across the country and let them experience our country's founding history and share their thoughts on why it matters, what it means today, and how they hope to use it to inspire their own citizenship. It became clear very early on that National History Day was the perfect partner for this work, and the program has benefited tremendously from their deep expertise and involvement. Last summer's pilot of YPCC was a huge success, with student-teacher delegate teams from the 13 original colonies, and we are excited to apply the lessons we learned in 2024 and to expand the number of participants this year to represent a greater cross-section of American geography. The history, tourism, and hospitality sectors here in Philadelphia have fully embraced YPCC as the city's opening act for 2026, and we've been blessed to receive significant philanthropic support from many of our local funders, allowing us to cover a significant portion of the program costs. Did you know that the words philanthropy and Philadelphia actually come from the same Greek word meaning love, and that Benjamin Franklin's efforts in colonial Philadelphia to raise funds to address community needs like healthcare, education, and libraries were the seeds of American philanthropy? As one of our old tourism slogans used to say, Philadelphia is the place that loves you back, and we hope you'll sense that energy when you are here. We've also designed YPCC to showcase the amazing array of historic sites, museums, and archives that we're blessed to have in Philadelphia, and that are eager to partner with us and engage you. You'll get a taste of this in July, and hopefully will inspire you to want to come back and explore more. Finally, as I mentioned on our orientation call in December, we're especially excited to add a new YCC component this year. As you learned in today's readings, the delegates to the First Continental Congress crafted several documents to capture their decisions and goals, including the Articles of Association, the Declaration of Colonial Rights, and the Petition to the King. And of course, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. In that spirit, we want you all, as the delegates to the 2025 Young People's Continental Congress, to create and collectively adopt a joint statement that reflects your aspirations for American democracy. We want this document to not only serve as a permanent legacy of your involvement in YPCC, but also to encourage elected officials, the media, and others to acknowledge and respect the voices of young people as our future leaders. We'll have more on this in the coming months, but I encourage you to start reflecting on this now and to keep this in mind as you prepare to come to Philadelphia. Thanks for listening, and I will now give the floor to Dr. Gillis.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Norris, for well, everything that you do to make YPCC happen. It's really a thrill and a pleasure for me to be back as lead historian for this program. I really enjoyed working with Carpenters Hall on National History Day last year. So it's very, very exciting to see what happens when we bring an even bigger group together to talk about this important history. So my name is Brendan Gillis. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning for the American Historical Association in Washington, D.C. I was formerly at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas, which also got snow this week, not too far from League City. And I'm a historian. I'm a historian of law and local government in the Revolutionary era. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about things that I care about quite a bit. Um, my topic today is the Continental Congress and its world. We're about to kick off a program about the Continental Congress and its historical legacy. And I thought it would be really, really helpful and important in the spirit of beginnings to spend some time talking about the Continental Congress, what it was, what it did, why it's important, and how it might inspire some of the actions that we're asking you to think about in our world today. Before I dive into that topic, I just wanted to take a sec to put this into the context of our program. So we have 5 online modules, one each for the next 5 months, that will culminate in the very exciting series of programs we have lined up in Philadelphia. And there's a method to our madness. Starting with the Continental Congress made a lot of sense. Next month, we're going to turn to a particular topic that was on the minds of many delegates in Philadelphia, law and justice, using the example of the Boston Massacre and my friend Dr. Kate Brown as a lens, as a way into the legal and judicial implications of the American Revolutionary conflict. Next, I'll take another turn and talk about liberty and freedom in the era of the American Revolution. We'll focus in on the experiences of Boston King, who was an enslaved man who ran away to freedom, fought during the Revolutionary War, actually for the British, and ended up securing his freedom in Canada first and Sierra Leone, Africa later. Our fourth module is about questions of economic liberty. Again, something that if you read the writings of the founders and the delegates at the Continental Congress was incredibly important. We've asked Dr. Justine Hill Edwards to talk about some of the research behind her new book on the Freedmen's Bank in the Reconstruction period. And lastly, we'll zoom out and look at language of rights, liberty, and justice in the 20th century in the context of women's rights with Dr. Sarah Rowley. So I'm very excited for all of these programs. For each module, we've selected a couple of readings. We've tried to keep them short and a mix of primary and secondary sources to help you really hone in on a topic that will be at the core of an online presentation like this one. And so I really encourage you to do the readings, to grapple with some of the questions that we're posing, because you'll get the most out of the experience of our sessions together. Now, tonight, my presentation is organized around 4 overarching guiding questions. First off, what was the Continental Congress? If we're going to be the YPCC, what exactly are we thinking about for the next 5 months? I also, since this is a National History Day program, and we'll be asking all of the students in the room to do their own National History Day project next summer, not this summer, but the summer following, the year following, I wanted to think about how historians research and study the Continental Congress to help inspire you to think about how you want to tackle some of your own historical research. Third, what can we learn from reading the Declaration of Independence? And lastly, this is a question that we won't be able to exhaust today. It's looking ahead to future sessions. What is the historical significance of the Continental Congress? So keep these questions in mind as I talk to you a little bit about some of the things that I find fascinating and compelling about the Continental Congress and the world in which it operated. Before we do that, though, I want to let you exercise your brains a little bit. This is a program that's focused on doing history. So I wanted to start with a warm-up. Let's look at a primary source together, an image. And so some of you may be familiar with this graphic, question, observe, reflect. It's from the Library of Congress. It's part of their method for making sense of primary sources, particularly visual sources from the past. And I want to focus on this first one, observe. So I'm going to show you an image. It's from the period that we're studying. And I want you to take a few seconds, look at it, and then I'm going to ask you a poll. I'm going to send a poll out to everyone that asks what you notice first. So what attracts your attention in this image?
Dr. Gillis, I'm ready with the poll. You give me the go.
Go for it.
So the question, I have to narrate this for those who might be listening later. What is the first detail in the image that caught your attention? So choices could be the clothing and hairstyles of the men, the ships in the background, the woman being held down in the center of the image, the teapot, or something else. This is one of those, there's no right or wrong. Go ahead, what's your first response? We've got about 80% of you who've answered. One note, if you are on a cell phone, you probably won't be able to answer the poll. But if you're on a desktop or a laptop, go ahead and lock in that answer. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Right. Our answers, 2% went with the men, 2%, one person, the ships in the background, 82% went with the woman in the center of the image, 6% the teapot, and 8% something else.
Great, thank you. And I think it's no accident that our attention is drawn to the figure in the center of the image, the woman who's being held down, because that's really the crux of this engraving. Now, this image is called The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught. It was first published in the London Magazine in May of 1774, and it intervened in the hot political topic of the day. So if your attention is drawn to the woman being held down here, the caption here, America Swallowing the Bitter Draught, gives us a clue as to who this is supposed to be. So if you look at a lot of images from this period America, the American colonies are often represented by a woman, also often by a Native American woman. This follows in the tradition of Columbia, who is the symbolic representation of America, and the indigenous population of the Americas. So what exactly is going on here? This is an image that was designed with an idea that it would be immediately comprehensible or recognizable to most of the people who saw it. It was published in London and circulated more in London than anywhere else. And if you follow politics from this period, you can actually identify who each of the people in this image are meant to represent. The man in the center who's pouring tea is Lord North. He was the British Prime Minister at the time. The man holding down the woman's arms is Lord Mansfield. He's the Chief Justice in this period. So the idea that not only are the political ministers imposing tea, they're forcing colonies to consume tea they don't want, but that the courts are complicit. They're holding them down. The character peeking up her skirt is Lord Sandwich, who was also one of the king's top ministers in this period. And so reading together the various different details and clues, we get a picture of the politics that this artist is advocating. It's pretty clearly critical of British policy towards the colonies. In the background, we see Boston cannonaded. A petition from Boston has been trod underfoot in the foreground. The woman in the background, who's holding a spear and hiding her face, is Britannia. That's supposed to represent Britain. Britain itself is looking away. The rights and liberties of British people are looking away from this scene with shame and disgust. Um, and so this is a direct critique and response to a series of bills that were passed in the British Parliament in early 1774. These bills are generally either referred to as the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts, and they were collectively a response to the Boston Tea Party. So you're probably familiar with one of the most famous events in the Revolutionary era. In December of 1773, some colonists in Boston, wearing light disguise, destroyed a whole bunch of East India Company tea by throwing it into the Boston Harbor. It turns out that if you want to make friends with British imperial officials, destroying their tea before you pay for it is not a good strategy. And so the leaders of Parliament, the Prime Minister and his cronies, decided that they needed to make a real statement. They closed the port of Boston. Boston's one of the busiest trading ports in the Americas. They shut it down entirely until the tea is paid for. So that's where we see Boston cannonaded in the back. They revoke the charter of Massachusetts and expanded the authority of governors to force colonists to provide housing for soldiers. So that's all sort of gestured to in the sword that says military law. The important thing to keep in mind here is that this was published for a London periodical. And we tend to think of the American Revolution as a sort of colonist versus British story. And it's easy to overlook the fact that actually many people in England were very critical of British imperial policy during this period too. They thought, hey, this isn't fair, this isn't just. And I wanted to start with this image and these examples, the coercive acts, because they're absolutely critical for understanding our first guiding question. What was the Continental Congress? Well, if we want to understand the First Continental Congress especially, it makes sense to look at just why this body was called into existence. And it emerged as a response to this set of legislation that was passed as a response to the Boston Tea Party. Almost immediately, committees and delegates in all of the British North American colonies started meeting to discuss how to respond. What do we do when British imperial officials are taking a step that seems unfair or seems to unjustly be limiting our rights? In September and October, 56 delegates from across British North America from 12 colonies. Sorry, Georgia. Georgia decided not to come. Met in Philadelphia at Carpenters Hall. And we'll actually get to go to Carpenters Hall and talk a little bit about what happened there 251 years ago now. Now, why were colonists so upset? How did we get here? I'm not going to go into all the details of the road to revolution, but I think it's worth stepping back and remembering that the revolutionary crisis is generally dated to the end of the Seven Years' War in 1763. There were roots and origins before this, but to make a long story short, conflict in the Pennsylvania backcountry draws England into a major global imperial war with France and Spain and a whole bunch of other adversaries. It's very, very, very expensive. And the British national debt explodes. And so almost immediately, British officials start trying to figure out how to pay off that debt. In 1765, they introduced the Stamp Act, which expands a tax on paper products that's already in existence in England and applies it to the North American colonies. This is horrendously unpopular and is revoked after a considerable amount of backlash. Um, in 1767, just a couple years later, Parliament tries again. They still have this huge national debt, don't know how to pay for it, so they introduce a series of additional taxes known as the Townshend Acts, that should be plural, um, that tax things like paint, and importantly, tea. This continues to spawn a bunch of protests. It's protests against the Townshend Acts that inspire the fight that turns into the Boston Massacre. In 1770, these Townshend duties, these taxes are repealed except for the tax on tea. And in 1773, the controversial Tea Act actually lowers the tax on tea as it applies to British colonists in North America. But on principle, opponents of British taxation in Boston staged the Boston Tea Party. That brings on the coercive acts. And voila, we get to the First Continental Congress, um, which adjourns with the idea that it may come back together after the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. That's essentially a foregone conclusion. And as many of you probably know, in 1776, the Continental Congress approves the Declaration of Independence. So the first Continental Congress, oddly enough, comes out of this debate about the coercive acts, but the first calls for it came from Pennsylvania and New York and were made by politicians who thought that, as opposed to events like the Boston Tea Party or outbreaks of violence or other kinds of conflict, that bringing people together to talk, to see if they shared a position, was likelier to sort of moderate some of this conflict that was unfolding. And so, in essence, the Continental Congress starts as a group of delegates representing 12 different colonies who come together to address a specific issue, what to do about the coercive acts, in hopes of trying to come up with a solution that would benefit colonists and potentially avoid future conflict with the British. So that's a good summary of the Continental Congress and what it set out to do. But of course, that's not a great way of really understanding the full significance of the Continental Congress. And so we're going to spend some time looking at a few more of the things that they did and thinking about the different ways in which historians go back to try to study this important institution. Now, the real issue at the heart of the resistance to the coercive acts, at the heart of all of these tax disagreements, was not actually taxation itself. Everybody recognized that someone needed to be levying taxes to pay for debts, to provide military protection. That was not a huge issue. The real question was who should be levying those taxes, and ultimately whether Parliament in Great Britain represented the people in its colonies in North America. So forgive me if this gets a little bit abstract, but I think this is helpful context, and I'll try and get straight to the point here. Most of the delegates in Philadelphia in 1774 and 1775 had lived most of their lives in the colonies, subject to colonial government within a larger British Empire. Many of them had enough property that they were eligible to vote in elections, and that meant that they got to elect people to colonial assemblies, legislative bodies in each colony that passed laws for that colony. Now, colonial government wasn't all wonderful and participatory. By the 1770s, almost all of the colonies have an appointed governor. A governor who's appointed by the king has usually, and in many cases, never set foot in the colony that he is tasked with governing. So there is this sort of tradition of participatory government in the colonies. But the colonies are all part of an imperial government that is located in Westminster, which is now part of London in England. The head of the imperial government is the king, definitely not elected in this period. It's an heritable position. And the king governs as part of an arrangement in collaboration with Parliament, which is the elected legislature for Great Britain itself. There's an extra layer here, the King's Privy Council, the characters who we saw in that engraving that we started with. Um, and Parliament passes laws not just for Britain, but for the entire empire in some cases. So if you asked delegates at the Continental Congress, were you represented in Parliament? Some of them would say no. We owe our allegiance to the king, but we don't vote for anyone. We have our own legislative assemblies. Like they're the ones who should be passing laws and taxes for us. And this is in the tradition that's called direct representation, this idea that you vote for people who make decisions for you. But if you asked a lot of people in Britain at this time, they would have said yes. Parliament already represented colonial subjects because most people in Britain didn't vote. There was not a very great system for determining where members of Parliament came from. And they said every member of Parliament represents all British subjects anywhere in the world. So you're already represented in this body that's passing laws for you. And this may seem like a weirdly abstract and philosophical debate, but it was the significance of it in terms of real policy was so significant that people were willing to rebel over this question. Like, who gets to decide what laws apply in the context where we live? Okay, so that's the big question that defines the first meetings of the Continental Congress. But I want to step back and think a little bit about how else historians can go about studying this important institution and the people who participated in it. So when I talk to undergraduate students about the work of historians, I always like to stress the importance of asking questions. Historians spend a lot of time trying to think what we need to know in order to better understand the past and how that understanding can help us better understand the world around us. And so every great history project starts with one and usually more questions. So in this case, it might be, what was the Continental Congress? Why does it matter? What did it do? To begin to answer those questions, we often read secondary sources. This is a term that most of you should be familiar with. National History Day has secondary sources and primary sources running through the rules in all of its categories. A secondary source, in a nutshell, is a source that you read to learn about the past, to reflect on experiences that were not part of the personal life of the author of the source. So secondary sources are set at one remove. They're talking about events and ideas and developments that the author was not part of. We also look at primary sources, and we spend a lot of time trying to find those primary sources and think about what those primary sources might look like. Primary sources, of course, are sources that give us direct insight into the lives of people who were participating in historical events. From those sources, we pull together evidence, which we contextualize, we put into a broader understanding of what was happening at around the same time. We analyze it to try to build as complete a picture as possible of the period that we're discussing. We develop an interpretation, a thesis, or an argument, and then we have to share that argument with others. So these are all things that National History Day asks its participants to flex. And we're going to be doing a lot of each of these over the course of our time together this year. So finding and using sources. Sure. We can go to Wikipedia and look up what happened in the Continental Congress. You could turn to a secondary source like a historian, a lecture from a historian such as myself, to help understand what happened in the Continental Congress. But you can also look at the writings of the delegates. As Richard Beeman's book makes clear, there's some real obstacles to studying the Continental Congress. Its debates were carried out in secret, and there was an agreement not to tell very many other people about what was happening behind the scenes. Of course, that was often neglected or ignored. And Charles Thompson, the secretary of the Continental Congress, was a much better politician than he was a note taker. So the records are kind of sloppy. Um, but we can actually look at the letters and other writings of people who were there. So in the case of some of the founding fathers, people who went on to make their reputation during the American Revolution, a lot of their papers have been saved and preserved. Um, a letter from John Adams to his wife Abigail Adams in September of 1774. So this is a couple of weeks after the Continental Congress first starts meeting. He complains about how difficult it was to work with this group. Its business was super slow. Um, People don't want to work very much. We sit only before dinner. They don't work at night, and they dine at 4 o'clock, early bird special. But most importantly, I think, from my understanding of the Continental Congress, he's very clear. This was a gathering of people from different colonies who didn't know each other, and didn't necessarily already recognize that they had a shared set of goals or a common cause. He wrote, 50 gentlemen meeting together, all strangers, are not acquainted with each other's language, ideas, views, designs. Therefore, they're jealous of each other. They don't trust each other yet. And that's important to keep in mind. One of the greatest accomplishments of the Continental Congress was in convincing itself, its delegates, and at least some of the people in the colonies that they reported back to, that there was such a thing as uh, a shared American experience. And what will happen a few months from now, when we all gather in July, is that we will get to be strangers, hopefully not quite as much strangers as the delegates in 1774 were, learning to interact with each other and building a community. Because few of the delegates who attended the First Continental Congress had ever met before. Very, very few of them would have met. Only those, some people in individual colonial delegations, and hardly any of them had traveled to Philadelphia. More of them had traveled to London than had traveled to Philadelphia. George Washington was the exception. In fact, most of the delegates at the time had a much better sense of the fashions of London, what was happening in London, the world, the news from London, than they did what was happening in the other colonies. And so part of the work of the Continental Congress was finding a common cause, if there was one to be found. We also read secondary sources. We look at the work of other historians because we don't necessarily need to or want to start from scratch, reinvent the wheel. In this case, for today, I asked you to read some excerpts from Richard Beeman's book that hones in on this period between 1774 and 1776 that historians often really celebrate as being hugely consequential to the American Revolution. This I asked you to read as a secondary source. It's written by a historian who is no longer with us, but it was written earlier in the 2000s. So someone who is definitely not alive in 1774. And I'll just note in passing that when historians read secondary sources, sometimes we do so really strategically and in a targeted way. Books have indexes, which are really helpful for honing in on passages that you want. But most often we focus on argument and on evidence. And so if you can work out what a chapter or what a book's argument is, if you can get what interpretation they're trying to convince you of, and then get a sense of their evidence, enough to decide whether it's convincing or not, um, there is no expectation that you'll remember every single line. Historians love facts and details, but we also know that a lot of those facts and details can be looked up later. You don't necessarily need to memorize things here. And Beeman's book, among various other points, reminded me of the extent to which the Continental Congress operated as part of a much larger world than just 12 colonies in British North America. There were actually 26 British colonies in the Americas in 1776. A bunch of them, including West and East Florida, colonies in Canada and the Caribbean, decided not to join in this rebellion. They didn't send delegates. And so when the Continental Congress wasn't drafting petitions to the king, they spent a lot of their time writing explanations to other people living in the British Empire, explaining what they were doing. So they sent formal addresses to Canada, the people of Britain, the Iroquois Confederacy, Jamaica, Quebec, and the colonists across British North America, some of whom agreed with them and some of them whom didn't. And their major landmark intervention in the First Continental Congress was a policy called the Continental Association that mandated boycotts and non-importation agreements for British manufacturers that actually, if you look at some of the specifics, give a sense of how integrated these colonies were to a British imperial world. They specifically mention East India tea, Madeira wine, enslaved people, and coffee and sugar and other products from the British plantations, other colonies in the Caribbean and in South America and elsewhere. Okay, so historians look at primary sources, they look at secondary sources, they try and build a context into around which to help better understand events that happened in the past. I also asked you to look at one of the most famous documents in American history, and certainly the most famous product of the Continental Congress itself, the Declaration of Independence. And so I'd like to pause now and give you another poll about the Declaration of Independence. Ms. O'Hara?
All right. Really simple question. Is the Declaration of Independence a primary source, a secondary source, or either a primary or secondary source depending on how you analyze it? We'll get some quick answers. I wish you all could see it. I get to see the bars going across as more people pick them. Unfortunately, the audience doesn't get to see that at the same time. But all right, we've got 83% in last couple. Make your picks. This is very interesting. All right, last call. It's time to share. In this group, 70% went for primary source, 30% went for the either or depending on how you analyze it.
Great. I try not to ask trick questions as poll questions. This was a bit of an unfair question because no source is inherently a primary source or a secondary source. This language best describes what you do with it, what you do with a source. Richard Beeman's book, which I assigned to you as a secondary source, because I think that's how it's most useful, could also be a great primary source for how history professors in the United States in 2009 were interpreting the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence, I want to make the case, is most useful as a primary source, but at the time in which it was produced, it was widely read as a secondary source because it made a whole bunch of arguments about what had happened over the last decade or so in British imperial policy. Part one is very much more immediately recognizable as a primary source in that it makes the case in philosophical terms for how rebellion could be justified. It lays out using Enlightenment values and natural rights language how it's possible that part of an empire could break away and declare itself independent. And it's a really powerful and well-written and thoughtful source that draws on lots of previous documents. And that's one of the reasons why this document is so influential and so famous. Part two, the longest part of the document, is quite explicitly a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, which is a fancy way of saying crimes or bad behavior. It's offering a history. And if you look really closely at the language of the Declaration and put it into the context of the period that it's describing, it's a history that has a very clear agenda. It's trying to convince people of a particular point of view. But if you look at those specific complaints, you might recognize some things that sound really familiar. So I was talking earlier about direct versus virtual representation. There's complaints about taxation, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, and for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. So all of these specific complaints can be traced back to specific incidents or pieces of legislation from Parliament. And they are always framed here in a way that is designed to try and make people as angry as possible, to compel people to embrace this really radical idea of independence. There's also language about the king abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province. That's a reference to Quebec. And the Quebec Act is often lumped in with the coercive acts and the intolerable acts. Looking ahead to our next module, for protecting soldiers by a mock trial from any punishment for murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, which is pretty clearly a reference to the Boston Massacre, and also some of the changes that would enable British governors to send people to England for trial if they thought that they wouldn't get a fair trial in the colonies. So we're going to talk more about the Declaration of Independence over the course of our time together. But I think recognizing that it is a statement of the values that many of the delegates came to embrace, and also recognizing that it was an intervention in an argument about recent events. It was making a claim about history. Will better enable us to go out and continue to investigate the legacy of the Continental Congress. And this period is really, really important because many of the figures at the time, many of the delegates themselves, and many subsequent historians have pointed to this as the phase, the period when the American Revolution became possible. So John Adams, much later in his life, looking back on his younger years, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he said, "The revolution was not the war. It was not the Revolutionary War. The real revolution took place between 1760 and 1775, when colonists began to rethink their relationship to each other and their relationship to political authority." And so I'll skip over this one. This is a slide that I included just because the operations of the Continental Congress are really, really tricky to understand in relation to other organizations. So teachers out there, you may find this one helpful. And I think this is a good place to come to our concluding question for today. One, again, we're not trying to resolve, but that I think may help us prepare for what's to come in the next few modules. What is the historical significance of the Continental Congress? Not just what did they do, but why does it matter today? So here are a few examples that historians have put forward and others have put forward to explain why this was so important, why it matters, and how it intersects with larger questions in American government and history. First, the Congress enabled representatives of diverse colonies to find common cause, to recognize America as being something that could host a United States. Second, the Congress began governing and developed some institutions that are still enshrined in part in the Constitution before it even got around to declaring itself independent. Third, in doing so, the Continental Congress redefined what it meant to be a Congress. Before this, most Congresses were groups of delegates representing various bodies that met to discuss a specific issue. By the time the Continental Congress enacts the Constitution, they've become a government, they've become a legislature, and they've taken on many powers. Number four, the Continental Congress embraced language of liberty, equality, and freedom. They didn't always live up to these ideals themselves, but these ideals have been hugely important in both US history and the history of the world in staking claims for freedom and equality elsewhere. And lastly, the Continental Congress, in its actions and decisions, created a model for independence movements around the world. There have now been, more than 150 declarations of independence in lots of different contexts. It's a hugely powerful and influential genre. So before we break for questions, I want to end with one last poll, and that's about which of these historical significances seem most important to you?
So which of these arguments is most interesting? Is it the common cause argument, declaring independence, refining the idea of what a Congress is, the language of equality and freedom, or the model for global movements? Oh, we've got some people jumping in on this one fast.
Yeah, and this one decidedly does not have a correct answer.
No, I think it's one that, we're going to start one way, and then the more you read, you might want to change your answer. I found that my answer has popped back and forth based on what we're reading on any given month. All right, a couple more people. Go ahead, block those answers in. And again, it's your answer right now. Like we said, you might change your answer next month or in March or April, and that's totally okay. All right, let's see where we ended. We definitely have a split on this one. About 24% went for common cause, 8% declaring independence, 6% the idea of a Congress, just under 40% for the language of equality for freedom. That was our biggest answer. But another 24% for model for global independence movement. So a nice spread on this one.
So as the person running the show, I don't have to choose. I think they're all important. And I will show redefining the idea of Congress a little bit of love, even though I'm not sure that I would choose it as my favorite. So with some suggestions about why this history matters, I thought let's wrap up, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Absolutely. Dr. Eels, can you put on the last slide with the QR code, or do you need me to do that? Excellent. All right, so here's what we're going to do. It's top of the hour, exactly. We hit our time mark tonight nicely. So we know that some of you have to go, and that's fine. What we'll ask at the end of each webinar is for you to complete a very brief survey. This does two things. Number one, it gives us your attendance. We know you made it to the end, but it also gives us some really important feedback that we share with the team, and we use it to tweak and adjust what we're doing moving forward. So you can get to it one of two ways. You can either use tinyurl.com/nhd-ypcc, or even faster, use your phone, scan the QR code. It'll pop you in and you can put your answer in. So we would love to use this time to transition to questions. What questions do you have about the history? Whether it's the history of what Dr. Gillis was talking about, whether it's the history of Carpenter's Hall, whether it's about what's coming up or travel, or heck, if you've got a good NHD question, we're here and happy to answer it. Looks like we've got at least one in the queue, but remember, we want you to ask questions. And I'm going to be pointed at our students here. If you're like, well, I have this question, but it's probably dumb because the kids in the other shades probably know the answer, I'm going to be honest with you. There's very few dumb questions. All right, there are a couple, but there are very few. And it's really important that you take the risk and ask the question. Because I'll be honest, when we were doing this, every time we did this program last year, and a student would raise their hand and ask the question, I would watch 3 or 4 other students go, So I'm going to ask you to be brave and ask some questions, because I think it's really important when you have an opportunity to work with such experts and really smart people who not only know a lot about this, but quite frankly, care a lot about this. It's a great opportunity. That being said, if you have to go, that's okay. The Q&A will also be on the video tomorrow if you've got to head out for the evening or the afternoon or the morning if you're out in Manila. So it looks like we've got a question. Ms. Hollyfield, what do we got?
So this is from Miss Van Haren. How were the representatives for the Congress chosen?
That's a great question. And as with just about everything in this period, it varies from colony to colony. There is no simple, straightforward answer. In most cases, they were chosen by the colonial assembly, who would then charge them. So, like the elected legislature of each colony would tap people, of course, it was someone who had to be willing to drop everything to go to Philadelphia in the middle of the fall, which I'm not sure I would want to. Yellow fever epidemics happen all too often, and there's a big smallpox epidemic that's about to break out. Um,
Well, and if you think about it too, like most of the time when we have a business trip, we know when we're coming up. We know we're there for 4 days or 5 days or 2 weeks. But these guys went and they didn't necessarily know when they were coming back. So I think that's an interesting part.
All right, so we have another question, actually two in the queue so far. Mrs. Rojas asks, can you help contextualize the grievance about populating these colonies? That is the hardest grievance for me to corroborate and to explain as a teacher.
sure. I think that makes sense because it's one of the ones where you're like, really? Um, the last time I really tried to think about this, the best explanation that I could come up with um, had to do with uh, the changes made around the proclamation line and efforts to limit westward expansion of the colonies. Um, a lot of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence really are exaggerated, whether you agree with them or not. They tend to push things to the extreme. And I know there were discussions mooted about trying to guide migration in certain areas. That's a great question. Let me I will spend some time thinking about it, and if I have any brilliant ideas, I'll send something your way, or we'll put it in the classroom.
And please don't be afraid to ask us a question. If we don't know it, we'll go find out. We'll go ask one of our friends. We do that all the time on NHD webinars. I can't tell you, usually after every webinar, we're emailing somebody some answer or posting it in the classroom with a follow-up link.
All right,
So we have some other questions.
Yep, we have two from students. I'm going to start with one. Although Adams writes of the spirit of independence in the public from 1760 to 1775, there was a notable attitude towards reconciliation and many loyalists, both inside and outside Philadelphia. Do you believe that this attitude Adams speaks of was overstated, or that he believed that the public truly supported independence?
Another fantastic question. I think Adams tends to put the rosiest possible Adams-friendly interpretation on things in his accounts. He's writing late in his life, long after these events took place. But he does have a point that independence was not even conceivable, beyond a few really radical voices in 1760. By 1775, there were plenty of loyalists. We don't want to try to reduce the perspectives of colonists to like too few categories. There were a lot of people who just wanted to bury their heads in the sand too. Um, and so it would be unreasonable to suggest that a huge number, a vast majority of colonists were patriots by 1775, but there were some. It was a significant demographic, whereas 15 years before it was essentially non-existent.
Well, I think we got to think about humans here too, right? As humans, we tend to talk to people who tend to think a lot like we do. We don't always tend to do as good a job about talking or engaging people who have different perspectives or different points of view. And that's something that's going to come up, and we're going to talk about that. Adams is hanging out with people like Adams who think like Adams. So that's going to influence his perspective. It doesn't necessarily mean he's wrong. This is his perspective. But it's important when we do history, we think about the different perspectives. And we're going to talk more about loyalist perspectives on the revolution. We're going to talk about indigenous perspectives on the revolution. All of this is coming up as part of our program in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and you've got to understand the Liberty Song. John Dickinson hadn't written the Liberty Song yet, so there weren't really any patriot bangers to get people out in the streets.
All
In
right.
1760, I mean. But
Okay, so in the same framework of different perspectives, somebody placed in the chat, while we examine the idea of freedom and liberty in the U.S. through the Declaration of Independence, where do we see our indigenous population show up? We talk a lot about enslaved people. Do we acknowledge the people that were here before the colonists?
yeah, this is a question we're going to spend a bunch of time with, especially when we're in person in Philadelphia. Um, I didn't really hone in on the references to indigenous people in the Declaration of Independence, in part because they're not kind. Um, uh, the American Revolution involved a lot of opportunism on behalf of British officials and American officials trying to sort of maximize the return on potential allegiance with indigenous allies. Um, but there were Native American polities. There were tribes that aligned with the British. There were tribes that aligned with the colonists. There were tribes that tried to stay out of the way completely because they saw how futile it could be. Um, and of course, some of the critical debates here are about access to Western land that didn't belong it belonged to indigenous people at this point. Um, and often when I teach about the end of the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris gave huge swaths of land away in negotiations. Much of North America is handed out as if European powers had any control there. They didn't, and they didn't invite indigenous diplomats to be part of the conversations there. So it's really important and exceedingly complicated, and a lot of the work of historical scholarship in the last decade or so on the American Revolution has paid much more attention to the significance of indigenous perspectives and actors, and I can recommend some books if you're curious because there's some great ones out there.
Well, that'll be a big piece of the Museum of the American Revolution does a really nice job of integrating the indigenous voices on both sides of the debate. And so we'll be bringing that in as part of our visit and one of our live speakers there. So stay tuned for more. That's the thing about history. You get so excited about one thing, like there's so much more, but we gotta pick and choose a little bit.
All right. So I'm going to move to a student question. This student said this seminar was amazing. It was very informative, including details and stances from historical leaders I previously did not know. I liked mostly understanding the difference between what the colonists thought of their representation in Parliament versus what actually happened. I had a question about the relationship between colonies. Can you expand on the tensions that might have happened with these still loyal to the king?
Yeah, sure. The loyalties of colonies that didn't rebel track often very closely with their economic relationship with Britain. So the West Indian, the colonies in the Caribbean that remained loyal to Britain, despite the address from the Continental Congress to the Assembly of Jamaica, um, they did so in part because they focused on plantation agriculture and they made um, sugar and molasses and rum for consumption in other places. So they were hugely reliant on British naval protection, British merchants for trade, and also British military protection. Because in places like Jamaica and Barbados, the enslaved population dwarfed the population of free colonists. And so they didn't want to risk. They were much less open to the idea of risking war with Britain or being abandoned to a possible slave rebellion or being picked off by one of the other European powers that always had eyes on British colonies. The people of Canada, too. Didn't respond too kindly to the protests around the Quebec Act. So the Declaration of Independence talks about, how the people of Quebec are held in slavish bondage and forced to obey laws and practice a religion other than the British do. And the people they sent an invitation to Quebec to join the Continental Congress anyway, but they they could tell they didn't really like their chances in a with colonists who were willing to criticize them so openly. Um, and Georgia is a case in point. They didn't come to the First Continental Congress because they were worried about the outbreak of war with their indigenous neighbors, and they knew that without protection from Britain, they didn't stand a chance. Um, and so all of those factors played into decisions as to why colonies did or didn't rebel. Um, and it was even more complicated for the loyalists in places like Pennsylvania, many of whom ended up leaving.
I think too that thread pulls through US history because there's a while where like, oh, Canada's going to become a state. And then it's like, well, Canada's not interested in becoming a state. And as we build up to the Spanish American War, there's questions about, well, Cuba wants to become a state. And they play with this Cuba thing a couple times. It never works out, but that thread keeps going through. And if you think about it, this government that then gets created goes and spreads west and builds more. So the thought that somebody else wants to come join us is not radical, even though we might look at it today and go, yeah, that was never going to happen. But keep in mind, when we're making these decisions, we've got to think about what the people at the time knew, what they thought, and what their frame of reference was, even if it doesn't necessarily match our frame of reference today.
Yeah, these have been fabulous questions, by the way. So thanks.
Yeah, I have two questions that kind of touch on the same thing regarding colony decisions and who was voting. So to follow up, were the number of delegates from each colony based on population or something similar, or were they just whoever was willing to attend if chosen?
There is a great discussion of this in the Beeman book. I think it's in part of the book that I didn't ask you to read. So that's a good resource for this. There was a debate quite early on about how votes should be weighted. In the end, each colonial delegation was treated as like one vote. They might have debates and disagreements within the delegation, but depending on whatever mechanism they determined for casting a vote, Um, it meant that it didn't really matter how many delegates there were in each uh, I'm calling them states, but they were colonies still at this point in their delegation. And so some of the bigger colonies sent more delegates just because they had more people who were interested in going. Um, but Mr. Norris will probably reference at some point Patrick Henry during the First Continental Congress. He gave a really famous speech where he said, "I'm no longer I'm more an American than I am a Virginian. Like I'm speaking today as an American." And this was actually, it's often taken out of context to say, look, people setting aside their loyalties and embracing this new identity. It was actually in a debate about whether the different colonies should have equal representation. And he's making the case like, I should be counted as a delegate. My vote should count. Virginia has more delegates here because I can represent all of the people of America. So it's intervening in this debate that becomes really important in the Constitutional Convention. Um,
All right. So I have another question. In your comments, you stated there were 26 colonies in total. How important was it to American colonies to gain the support of the other colonies that existed at that time?
Well, it certainly increased the odds that they might be successful. I think they recognized the Continental Congress immediately starts doing diplomatic work. They start thinking about outreach very soon to France, and they have delegates in Britain who are going to Parliament and trying to represent the interests of the colonies. In fact, I almost mentioned it. 250 years ago this week, the uh, the petition to King George that came out of the First Continental Congress was officially entered into the record of the British Parliament. And on January 26th of 1775, Ben Franklin and a few other American delegates went to try to speak to Parliament, and they wouldn't let them. They weren't interested. Uh, the arguments they were making went over like a ton of bricks. So this was actually a really important week 250 years ago in the history of the American Revolution, even if most of the delegates were at home trying to stay warm. So I think I managed to answer the question that I hoped someone would ask, as opposed to the question that you did. Um, so remind me again, Miss Holyfield, what was the
Wow.
question I was answering and then went off on a tangent?
So basically the question was, in your comments, you stated there were 26 colonies. How
Hmm.
important was it for the American colonies to gain the support of the other colonies that existed during that time?
Um, it was definitely something that a lot of the delegates were thinking about. Like I said, they did send an address to the people of Canada and Quebec and Jamaica, um, luring support from the British Caribbean colonies, which were much more economically important in Britain, was likelier to force the British to make some concessions. So I think they weren't necessarily thinking that the Caribbean would rebel with them, but they might be able to get a better agreement out of British ministers. Canada and Quebec especially were different because the most objectionable thing about the Quebec Act to most colonists at this time period was that it promised most of Ohio, this big swath of the upper Midwest to Quebec, and they wanted it themselves. And so the idea of bringing Quebec in was really attractive because it also could give them clearer title to this land. Again, land that no European yet really had a solid claim to.
Awesome. So this one question also talks about underserved groups. So this is from a teacher. Dr. Gillis, this was so easy to listen to, well worth our time. how do you think we can best show our pride for parts of this history while recognizing underserved groups and not overly romanticizing the events? Even the disagreements tend to be seen in a light that just may not be true.
Yeah, that's the $5 million question. And I think we're still waiting to see how the national semi-quincentennial celebrations attempt to navigate that question and answer it productively. Um, I mean, I think I find history much more compelling when you're looking at real people negotiating difficult questions in difficult circumstances. Um, and, we don't need everyone in the past to be a hero or a villain. History isn't told through statues. And so, um, I think there are things to admire in a lot of the founding figures. There are some that I like better than I like others for various reasons. But I also think that this history is both most accurate and most interesting when it points out the ways in which the revolution itself sort of unleashed a world of possibility. Um, uh, the idea that all men are created equal didn't necessarily mean to Jefferson how it was heard and interpreted by free and enslaved African American people. And certainly he wouldn't have anticipated the various other ways in which it's been put to use by civil rights movements and independence movements across the world. Um, I think at the core of good history is empathy, trying to understand people in the past rather than necessarily leap to judgment. There is space for judgment, but it's not the only or even the best way of engaging with people in the past. And uh, that having a sense of empathy and humility allows us to go back and say, yeah, let's revisit the Continental Congress and grapple with some of these hard questions.
Well, and I think the complexity makes it far more interesting and far more fun. I think sometimes there's a sense, well, we can't teach that side. Oh, no, I think we have to teach all the sides. Because I think one of the things that we're trying to help students do is to say, okay, what's your interpretation? What is your argument or your thesis or your claim? And we're not here to tell you what that is, but we are going to say, well, what's your evidence? How do you know? What's your proof? Because, one of our phrases at History Days we say is that evidence matters. And it's finding the evidence that lets you make your claim. And in history, historians disagree with each other, right? They have different interpretations. Interpretations change over time, particularly as more evidence becomes available. Or maybe we look at evidence that we had but never really paid attention to, or look at it in a new light. And that's how history books that are written today are different than books written 40 years ago, 80 years ago, 150 years ago, because we are seeing the same events in new context, in new lights, and with new evidence. And I think that we can talk about it that way without feeling like we're telling like the bad side of history, or we're dismissing it, because the reality is we can't just dismiss and we can't just accept. We have to actually look at it and grapple with it in our own terms.
We have about 3 more questions, if that's okay. So speaking of founding fathers, this one's from a teacher. Aside from being young and all the other qualifications, quote unquote, that Thomas Jefferson was endowed with, what convinced the quote unquote leaders to choose him to unanimously author the Declaration of Independence?
Um, Also, Richard Beeman's book has a good theory as to why that was the case. Um, Jefferson had actually written several documents that, if you go back and look at them, clearly are almost first drafts, pre-drafts for the Declaration. He was eloquent, and he was uh, accomplished. He thought a lot about these questions. And if you've ever tried to write anything by committee, usually what happens is one person actually writes the thing, and then everybody else works on editing. So um, I don't know that there was ever a concrete decision. Well, we'll just let Jefferson do it. But he didn't really give them any other choice. And uh, there are some serious, significant revisions between Jefferson's first drafts and what gets enacted. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple of those in a couple of modules. Um, but you know, when you're presented with a document like what he drafted, it's hard to ignore.
This question comes from a teacher, and I actually was curious about this as well. Can you give more information about how the British viewed the policies in the colonies? You mentioned that they were critical. In what other instances did they criticize the government for their actions?
Yeah, so this gets into the heart of late 18th century British party politics. Um, it's not quite as polarized and partisan and divided as it is today, but not completely far off. Um, so many of the Whigs who were the Whig Party is the party of reform. They wanted to reform the British electoral system generally to make it more representative. And a few prominent leaders there really looked at what the ministers were doing to the American colonies and objected. But at the time of the American Revolution, the government was a Tory government. Lord North was a Tory who theoretically align more closely with the interests of the king and are a slightly more conservative um, party by the conservative and progressive axis looks very different in the 18th century than it does today. Um, and yeah, so I'd say the big issue that many folks want, the biggest place that there's disagreement between Whigs and Tories is about who gets to vote and how representation in Parliament is determined. Um, but like party politics today, they disagree about all sorts of other things too. They disagree about the response to the French Revolution. They disagree about the American Revolution and taxes. Um, and just to give one really quick example, when we go to the Museum of the American Revolution, it opens with colonists in New York tearing down the statue of George III that had been erected just a few years before when the Stamp Act was repealed. They also put up a statue for William Pitt the Elder, a British Whig politician, who was really seen as a hero because he said, like, hey, this Stamp Act thing, it's not good. And his speeches on it actually sound a little bit like Dickinson's Liberty Song, to come full circle. Yeah, and so there's also some really great books about British politics around the American Revolution and what's happening in this period. Um, and I, as a historian of this period, really nerd out over it. So thanks for asking.
All right. And our last question is from a student. She states, I saw Abigail Adams mentioned in a slide, and all I could think about was her letter to John Adams to remember the ladies. Was her advocacy for women's rights seen in the Continental Congress and or in their meetings? We know of their feelings towards equality, but we also do know that women weren't fully seen. Was this addressed by the timeline of the Continental Congress or later in time?
Um, Wonderful question. I think there's a tendency because the Remember the Ladies letter exchange is so often used to help understand women in the American Revolution. We tend to think of it as like a public document. I doubt anyone else in the Continental Congress would have read this at the time, other than John Adams himself. And one of the things I really love about the exchange, I don't that necessarily love John Adams' politics here, but they're clearly like flirting with each other a little bit. There's a sort of a comfortable tongue-in-cheek tone that really sort of defines the exchange. Neither one of them is being entirely serious, I think. Um, but there were people really beginning to make claims for expanded rights for women in this period. And uh, women were one of the demographic groups for whom the turmoil of the American Revolution created new opportunities they didn't necessarily want to give back up. And at least initially, there were a few instances where women's rights broadened slightly. I think the New Jersey state constitution, the first state constitution in New Jersey, allowed widows of property holding men who met the voting qualification to continue to vote if their husband died. Which is again like not great progress, but it's something. And when people start talking about all men being created equal, almost immediately, women start asking, "Well, what about us?" So yeah, I think there are some great National History Day projects to be done on that topic.
All righty. And we're 2 minutes over our mark. We went a little long, but those questions were so good. I think it was absolutely worth the time. Thank you to those of you who stuck it out to the end. If you haven't done so already, take a second, jot down tinyurl.com/nhd-ypcc, or just use your phone, take a quick picture of the QR code. If you're doing this on your phone and you're like, wait, I don't know how to do it, it's okay. You're going to get an email tomorrow. We'll get you the link and we'll get you your credit that way. At this point, I want to say a huge thank you, Dr. Gillis. Thank you, Mr. Norris, and all the team at Carpenters Hall for all of the vision you've provided. We are so excited to be bringing these 28 teams to Philadelphia. And fun fact, 28 times 2 is 56, just like the 56 delegates. So we are excited to see you online, see your homework this week, and then get you kind of wrapped and ready and into module 2 on Friday. So have a good night, stay safe, stay warm. We'll see you live next month, but if you have questions, need help, have specific travel questions, reach out. We are more than happy to answer. If you're never sure, Ms. Hollyfield is your main point of contact. She can take the questions, either answer them or direct them to the right team member. So when in doubt, shoot an email, give a call, or schedule a time for a meeting. We're happy to do any of those 3. All right, I'm going to pause our recording and we'll wrap for the evening.